welcome to Once More with Style, considering whether your project needs a style guide here at JavaScript and Friends Conference. Hi, I'm John. I go by Gene Hack most places online, and this is the pre-COVID edition of my face shot. You can see that there have been a few mask-related changes recently. Before I get into the talk, I want to let you know that I originally wrote this talk to be very interactive. I ask a lot of questions of the audience, and I like to have sort of a conversation as we go talking about style guides. Now, the conversation part might not work out that well, but I'm hopeful that folks will still be able to respond to my questions in the chat as we go. So I guess we'll see how that works out. So to get started, what is a style guide? A style guide is just a document that explains how code and other similar structured parts of your project should be organized and formatted and laid out. Who's worked on a project with a style guide before? Style guides are modified on sort of the original style guides, which were for print and for language in general. So things like the AP style guide, which describes how to lay out newspaper articles, or a book called The Elements of Style, which is a fairly well-known guide to writing properly grammatical English. Style guides don't have to address just code. They can also include things like configuration file layouts, file and directory organizations, basically anything that you are doing in your project where you want to write down how you're doing it and say, this is how we do it. This is an example from a style guide that we wrote for a project at my workplace. This particular section covers table naming and definitions for SQL schemas. And you can see we've got a certain structural convention. So the style guide itself is written as Markdown, which means that it's easy to turn into a web page and put up so people can refer to it easily. Everything's numbered and laid out in a hierarchical fashion. So all the rules have specific references. If you need to communicate with people, that makes it easy for everybody to know what you're talking about. We also use RFC 2119 style language. So you'll see these capitalized keywords like must and should, must not, should not. And that lets you easily tell which rules we're saying are must be adhered to, they're required, or they should be adhered to, they're just strongly suggested. There are a number of pros to having a style guide, a number of benefits. So let's walk through those. One is that you reduce the number of times you have to have an argument with somebody about the style, the coding style that they're using. This is a tweet from my coworker, not to pick on my coworker, but mainly because I'm pretty sure I'm one of the people he was talking about when he talked about reviewers cringing, because using single if statements without braces is, yeah. Anyway, having a style guide means that you don't have to have this argument each and every time. You can just point to the style guide, and hopefully that resolves the argument. That, in turn, speeds up code review. You can spend more time during your code review looking at what you're actually supposed to be looking at, which is, does the code do what it's supposed to do? Does this change make sense? And you don't have to spend a lot of time having petty arguments. You can have important ones. That, in turn, helps code review to be more productive. People spend more time focusing on real issues and less time arguing about stylistic changes. It can also have the effect of reducing the amount of churn in your code base. If you have a style guide that specifies how things are supposed to be formatted and laid out, you don't have the problem of the new person joining the project and deciding that they want to change all the spaces into tabs, for example. Not that that would ever happen. Finally, well, not finally, but a style guide can also make it easier to onboard new folks to a project. Because there's less confusion around how things are done, new people can feel more confident that they're doing things the right way the first time. They don't have to be concerned that they might spend a lot of effort making a change only to be told that they made the change all wrong. This is especially important for open source projects or projects where you're trying to get a lot of outside contributions and you want to encourage more casual contributors to expand the pool of people who are working on your project. Style guides can also be helpful in establishing what the project idiom is, particularly when you're working in a language that allows you to say the same thing or carry out the same types of operations in subtly different ways. JavaScript being one of these languages, it's sometimes good to say, no, this is how we do this particular thing. There's this other alternative, but that's not how we do it on this project. And a style guide is the right place to write that kind of thing down. Finally, having a style guide sends a strong signal about your project culture. It says, we care about this stuff. These things might seem small and trivial to you, but we really care about them. We think they're important, and we've taken the time to write this stuff down because we care about that, and we care about helping out people who aren't familiar with the project understand our ways. There are also some downsides to having a style guide associated with your project. One, probably the biggest one, is that it takes a substantial amount of time to write a good style guide. I've got a couple of examples in this talk from a style guide we wrote for a large multi-year project at work that we wrote during one period of sort of downtime while we were trying to codify things. That style guide is about 2,500 lines of markdown, which is about 53K kilobytes of text. And it took around a month of sustained effort by a senior developer to produce the initial version of the style guide. It's extremely comprehensive, and it was for a project that included a Node API, several web apps consuming that API, a database layer behind the API, and the style guide covers how all of the code for all of that stuff should be written. So your style guide might not need to be that big, but it is a substantial effort to undertake. Writing a style guide can be contentious. The majority of the work was done by that one senior developer, but he was also consulting the rest of the project team while he was going. And we had several multi-day long discussions where things occasionally got heated. You basically imagine every style guide argument you've ever had, or every style argument you've ever had, but you're having them sort of all at once sequentially. The flip side of that being a con is the pro version of that is you get that all out of the way one time and then you're sort of done. You can just say, no, we talked about this. This is how it is. Another downside is your style guide definitely needs to be a living document. It has to be maintained, not continuously, but you will discover over time things that you thought were clear are actually a little ambiguous. You might need to update it to reflect changes to the language. You might need to update it to reflect changes to the general consensus around the right way to do things in your language. Finally, another potential downside of a style guide is that it sends a strong signal about your project culture that some people might interpret as these people are no fun, they're very concerned with these tiny nitpicky things, and I don't want to play with them or contribute to their project because they're just such sticklers. Sometimes you can't win. So let's look at a few more examples of style guides. This is, again, from that style guide from my workplace for the node-based project. And here we have objects section. We have a rule saying use the literal syntax for object creation. We have a why section that gives the rationale for the rule. Here in the example sections, we're showing both the right way to do it as well as a bad way to do it, or the wrong way to do it. And this is important and useful because if you just show people the right way, they might not understand what wrong way you're telling them not to do. And then finally, we have the specific eslint rule around this. Eslint is what's called a linter. I'm going to talk about linters here in 5 or 10 slides. If you're not sure what they are, just hold on, we'll get there. There's another section about using arrow function notation for anonymous functions. Again, we have the reference to eslint rules. We have the rationale for why you might want to do it. And we also have a rationale for why you might not want to do it. This is not as strongly worded of a rule. Sometimes you might need to break a rule. And it's usually good to indicate why you might need to break a rule. Here's if you have a fairly complicated function, you might want to move it into a named function expression rather than using an anonymous function. Style guides don't always have to be 100% normative. They can allow for nuance. A few examples of well-known style guides that you may want to look at. One is the Airbnb JavaScript style guide. This is available on GitHub, and it's reasonably well thought out. It's pretty opinionated. I don't agree with all of it, but we're not going to walk through the entire thing. There's also Google's JavaScript style guide, which again is pretty opinionated. The important thing to remember with the Google JavaScript style guide, as with all things that you read about best practices coming out of Google, is to remember that you are not Google. And the way they do things may be appropriate for Google scale, but you're probably not at Google scale. Finally, a relatively new style guide, I think that I just ran across recently, the SQL Style Guide by Simon Hollywell, is all about how to format your SQL, both for queries you may have literally laid out in files, or for schema stuff that you might be including in your projects. It was a really good read. I really enjoyed it. So if you decide to use a style guide, once you've gone through the effort of writing it, how do you make sure folks follow it? You don't want to spend the effort to put it together only to have people on the project ignore it and then have the project drift out of alignment with what you've decided is the right way things should be done. The only real answer to that is you've got to automate it somehow. You want to make complying with the style guide the low friction way to do things. You want to make it harder to not comply with the style guide than it is to just go along with what the style guide says to do. And the way to do that is by outsourcing it to a variety of tools, which we're going to talk about. There are three categories of tools I'm going to talk about today. There are linters, which are programs that help detect semantic problems with your code or other formatting issues in a code semantic way. They work on the basis of rules that you can define or collections of rules that you can use that other people have put together. Then there are code formatters, which are programs that are strictly concerned with how your code is laid out, how long your lines are, where you place brackets around things, purely stylistic code level changes done by formatters. And then finally, there are a few other helpful tools that I'm calling helpers that will enable you to make sure that the linters and the formatters and the definitions that the rules for your linters and formatters get applied consistently and all the time. So let's talk about each one of these types of tools in turn with some specific examples. We're going to start with eslint, which is the linter you should be using if you're writing any sort of JavaScript at all. JavaScript has a pretty long history of different linters, starting off with the original JavaScript linter JSLint, which a few years after it came around got forked and turned into something called JSHint. And the two of those together sort of inspired the creation of a separate program called eslint. And the innovation that eslint added was to allow people to define their own rules. JSLint and JSHint just came with a set of rules and you couldn't really modify them. ESLint you can write your own rules for if you want to. Other linters for JavaScript, such as JSCS and TSLint that have been developed subsequent to ESLint, have ended up getting folded back into the ESLint project. So for JavaScript, including TypeScript, ESLint is what you should be using right now. And as I said, eslint works on the basis of rules. This is one particular eslint rule that requires you to use let or const instead of using var when you're declaring a variable. There are hundreds of these rules, if not thousands, that are arranged in various sets that you can find on the internet. There are specific sets for programming in Node versus programming JavaScript for use in a browser. There are ones that are more focused on security, and so forth and so on. If you look for eslint-config star on NPM, you'll find a whole bunch of different bundles that you can load in your NPM-based projects that will help you with your code linting. Let's talk about formatters. Who uses Prettier? Who's heard of Prettier? Who uses it? Prettier is an example of what's called an opinionated formatter. This is sort of a type of formatter that really got started by Go with a program called Go Format. And the thing is, an opinionated formatter gives you very few options, very few things to configure. It has an idea of what good style is, and if you use that formatter, that's what you get. And I'll show you an example of that here in a minute. Prettier started out handling JavaScript, but at this point it handles pretty much any file type you would use in a JavaScript or web project. It can handle JSON, HTML, CSS, and various sorts of CSS preprocessor syntax, GraphQL, Markdown, and YAML. With plugins, it can handle Java, PHP, Ruby, Swift, and other languages. So when I said it was opinionated, what I mean is that if you run your code through Prettier, you're going to get a cuddled else. And this is a cuddled else. It's the form of layout where you put the else on a line and it's surrounded by the closing bracket of the if and the opening bracket of the else. Now, you may not prefer cuddled elses. Personally, I don't. I like to format my code like this. I like the else on a line all by itself because that balances out the if being on a line all by itself. But this is not how Prettier does it. You cannot make Prettier do this. There's no option for it. If you run this code through Prettier, this is what you get. I have made my peace with this because the good side of having an opinionated formatter is that once you adopt it, all of your formatting arguments pretty much go away. There are a few things you can configure in Prettier, but not very many. You don't really need a configuration file, but if you decide to use one, you can put it either at .prettierrc within your project, or you can put it in package.json under a top-level key called prettier, and then you just include the JSON that would have been in the configuration file. Some things that you can set are the trailing comma style, whether one gets included after the last element in a list or not, and the tab width, and whether you use single quotes or double quotes by preference, stuff like that. There are a few knobs you can twist, but not many. And generally in JavaScript projects that I've worked on, I haven't needed to have any prettier configuration. Out of the box, it's pretty good. There is another formatter option that you can use instead of prettier or alongside prettier. It's called editorconfig. And it's configured with a file called .editorconfigrc. You can have one of these files at any level of the hierarchy, a directory hierarchy. Editorconfig, which is integrated into many popular coding editors, either directly or via a plugin, will search up the directory tree and apply successive editor config settings as it finds them. This is what an editor config file looks like. It's got a number of options. It's sort of a vaguely INI style format. You can have a few top-level options, like this says this is once you see this particular editor config file, don't look above this in the directory hierarchy for any others. This says the rules that follow apply to any file, because a star matches any file. And what this says is we're going to use Unix-style new lines, just a line feed. We're going to insert a final new line at the very end of a file, and we're going to strip any trailing white space off of any line. This is a set of rules that apply to files with these suffixes or extensions, UTF-8 character set 2-space indents using spaces for indents. And then finally, if we have a makefile style file, we're going to use tabs because that's what you do in a makefile. Finally, helpers, other helpful programs to have around to use with your linters and formatters that we should mention. These are specifically for JavaScript projects. One is called Husky, and the other is called lint-staged. I should mention that this is not actually an official Husky logo. It's just a cute picture of a dog that I couldn't resist using. So what Husky does is it automatically sets up client-side Git hooks for you to run particular programs. So what we're saying here is, hey, Husky, set up our hooks so there's a pre-commit hook that runs lint-staged. And what lint-staged does is in this lint-staged config, which can be, so your Husky config always goes in package.json. Your lint-staged config can go in lint-staged.rc or in package.json under a lint-staged top-level key. What this config says is for each one of these file types, for each one of these file extensions, for JSON, Sass, and YAML, we're going to run prettier -- list different. For JavaScript files, we're going to run prettier -- list different, and then we're also going to run eslint. And if this command or this series of commands when it runs, if any of them return an error or don't return a true value, lint staged will not return a true value. And what Husky says is when this lint staged command running as the pre-commit hook doesn't return a true value, don't allow the commit to go forward. So what we're effectively saying with this combination of these two configurations is if you're trying to commit, trying to check in using get, trying to commit a JSON file, and Prettier says, oh, hey, this file is not properly formatted according to my rules, that commit will not work. What this does is it allows you to sort of enforce on each developer's local machine that they have to follow they have to have things set up so that they're formatted properly according to Prettier. And for JavaScript files, they have to follow all the eslint rules as well, or they're not allowed to check the file in. This is great. It dramatically increases the compliance you have with your style guide, which you want to have everybody complying with your style guide again, because you've spent a lot of time writing it, you might as well get some benefit out of that. You still do need to have at least one last line of defense. People can work around Husky and lint staged, even if they're properly set up and configured. There is a command line flag to git commit that you can use to tell it to skip all the hooks, which is annoying, but people can work around them. Sometimes people work around them unintentionally. We had, at a project at work, we had a very contentious issue where one developer kept committing things that weren't formatted properly according to Prettier, and he swore up and down that he had everything configured correctly, and people were getting very, very mad thinking that he was bypassing the checks. And it turned out that he wasn't. He was just using a very, very old version of Git that wasn't compatible with Husky, so the hooks weren't getting installed correctly. It took us about 2 months to track down what was going on and a whole lot of what the hell, how come Bob's code is always not formatted right. So you do still need to have some last line of defense. That's pretty much always going to come down to somebody looking at it in code review. So even when you're doing code review, if you think you have all this stuff set up properly, you still need to have, the occasional question of, is that actually formatted properly, and check and verify. In summary, kind of the TLDR for this talk, style guides are pretty good, but they're not necessarily for every project. If you have a larger project with a lot of people working on it, you expect to maybe be onboarding some new people to it, having some other people rolling off of it over time. There are some significant advantages to having one. If you have a large open source project or a project that you'd like to be a large open source project, having a style guide may make it easier to attract new contributors and get them up to speed, and maybe even turn some drive-by single patch contributors into more frequent contributors. If it's a smaller project, if it's only you or you and one or two other people, it may not be worth your time to write a formal style guide, but I would argue that you're still going to see quite a bit of benefit if you just sit down and maybe don't write it all out formally, but include Prettier in your package setup, include some ESLint rules in your package setup, and require any contributions to adhere to those conventions before you accept them. Thanks. I'd like to say a few specific thanks. One, thanks to Mike and Andrew. Mike, this guy on the left here, is the guy who spent all the time writing that internal style guide, which informed a lot of my thoughts about this. Andrew was one of the people who pushed for us to write the internal style guide. I tried to talk him into giving this talk, and he went and wrote a completely different talk, so I had to write this talk. So thanks to both of them. Thanks to the organizers of JavaScript and Friends for accepting the talk. I really wish I could have been able to give it to everybody in person, but given the circumstances, this is the best alternative. And finally, thanks to my employer, Infinity Interactive, for giving me some time at work to work on this talk and to record it. We do custom software development. We like interesting problems. We like to help people solve interesting problems. So if you have some interesting problems or you're in need of some consulting around software development or workflow, please give me a call. I'd love to talk to you about how we can help. Finally, thank you for attending the talk. I hope you're enjoying this virtual conference. I know I hope I am. I'm recording this talk in advance, so I can't say that I am enjoying it. And thanks. I'm happy to take questions in the chat.